Hi, guys. Some of you might recognize me from yesterday from the Migration Matters presentation. Migration Matters was founded earlier this year. Before that, there was Collidoscope, which I founded with Kelly Miller, who was also here yesterday for Migration Matters. A little confusing, two separate projects. Collidoscope Berlin is, the simplest way to describe it would be a blog. If you go on our website, that's what it looks like. We write articles and stories about immigration. We use social media to comment about current events related to immigration and build our audience, and we share resources and things like that. But what we're trying to do with Collidoscope is, similarly to Migration Matters, is generate an open conversation. And whereas in Migration Matters, we let the evidence kind of speak for itself and stay as objective as we can, for Collidoscope, we have a really clear agenda, which is to promote the idea of inclusion and to view the city as a microcosm of a global community that we can learn from and become more connected through. Kelly, on the left, she's a sociocultural anthropologist, and my background's in international education. We're not trained journalists, but you know, Berlin and beyond, there are a lot of people who start blogs just because they're interested in a topic, and for us, that was always immigration. We both have migration stories as well, and we wanted to become part of the discourse and a very positive part of that discourse. So to start, you might be wondering what kaleidoscope means. Kaleidoscope is a combination of two words that we came up with. Collide as in, I feel so awkward here. Can you hear me if I talk like this? It's okay? Oh, I don't need to like lean in? Oh, it's good. It's sore. Collide as in things coming together, a collision. And then kaleidoscope, that thing you look through that, you know, distorts kind of the way you see things and makes it kind of pretty and colorful. So through these two words, we came up with kaleidoscope, which means a positive and colorful collision of perspectives, communities, and peoples through immigration. So, in our work, we operate under a few kind of assumptions that inform the work that we do, the articles that we write. One is that we believe that our definition of international, what it means to be international or worldly, is sometimes very limited. I haven't been around for the whole conference, but I'm sure that someone has mentioned something about how the term integration is a bit problematic sometimes because it denotes that there's still this mainstream culture that we need to integrate the not mainstream people into, which is why we don't use that word as often. We tend to use the word inclusion because we believe it puts the onus on everyone to create a welcoming community where everyone is valued for who they are. And this idea that, you know, it's great to be international and cosmopolitan, a lot of people believe that, but then on the other side, some forms of diversity or difference are considered bad or negative. This image is actually from Rathaus Wilmersdorf, where I volunteer. I teach a literacy class to mostly Afghan women. And they obviously are representing, you know, sometimes a culture that is viewed, or a difference that is not viewed as positively as others. We come across this in our work sometimes when we interview people, you know, who tell us, you know, I'm German, but I have Turkish background or Arab background, and I don't speak on the streets Turkish or Arabic to my kids because people will look at us strangely. If you're French, if you're Spanish, you might not get that sort of look. You know, there's just this idea that certain diversity is not as good as other diversity. And of course, that's dependent on the context of the country that you're in. In my field, from international education, we talk a lot about this idea of 21st century skills. Some of you may have heard that term before. In addition to certain kinds of literacy, a lot of the skills that you're supposed to have in if you want to be successful in the 21st century have to do with culture, intercultural communication, being able to work with people who are different from you, collaborating, seeing things through different perspectives, speaking other languages. And this is touted as such a great thing. And then when it comes to our cities and the diversity within our own cities, we don't seem to use that very as an opportunity. We often see it as more of a challenge. All right, secondly, we believe that the city is a reflection of the we, and that through the lens of migration, that we can understand better who we are on individual, local, and global levels. So practically, a lot of us live in cities these days. In 2008, for the first time, over half of the world population lived in cities. By 2050, that percentage will be up to 70%. And a city like Berlin, I mean, there is such a collision of different cultures and religions and perspectives. And we see these different spaces as learning spaces, as pockets of opportunity. And it goes beyond, like, let's go eat Vietnamese food tonight. Yeah, that's great. Nice that you have access to that, but there are so many other different ways to create meaningful connections in the city, and this is something we try to highlight in our stories. One more thing. Also, what is great about cities is that, of course, not everyone is privileged enough to travel the world and to see things outside of where they grew up. And a city is a place, if you live in a city, you have access to those spaces as well. Thirdly, we believe that storytelling is a really powerful tool. Stories have been around forever. I think 27,000 years ago, the first cave drawings were discovered. Stories have existed long before us and will continue to exist long after we're gone. They're a fundamental way that we communicate. And of course, today, the way we consume stories has changed. They come packaged in different forms. But the science is there that tells us that when you're told a story, different parts of your brain are activated that create more connections and make them more memorable. So if I put up a bunch of bullet points right now, certain parts of your brain would be activated, and those would be the language processing parts of your brain. And those are the parts that kind of denote meaning from words. But that's it. If I tell a story, other parts of your brains will be activated that would, as if they were experiencing it, as if you were experiencing it yourself. So we believe that storytelling is really powerful, but just a story is not necessarily good enough for what we're trying to do, because a story can be great. You can read something and you might feel pity for someone or sympathy for someone, or be really interested in their background, but it's one person. A personal story is just that. It's personal. It can be dismissed as one example. So we try to merge the storytelling aspect, the personal aspect, with the political and historical context. So we talk about personal stories, but how policy is lived through people, and also to educate and inform people about the context that is there that has informed the way that person experiences their life. I'd like to give one example. This is a story I wrote a couple years ago. It's me on the left. On the right is Orhan. Orhan is a taxi driver. The title of the article is Taxi Driver. But I met him in a really different context, in our half-marathon training group, where we ran once a week together. And I think if I had met Orhan in a taxi cab on the way to the airport, I probably would have assumed he's a German of Turkish background. Maybe his parents came as guest workers, and I would have left it at that. But Orhan's story is much more complicated than that. His father was a guest worker from Turkey who came over in 1972, which is 1 year before West Germany at the time halted guest worker recruitment. And Orhan grew up in Kurdistan, in a small town called Hotan. If you look at the orange parts of that graph, that's the Kurdish areas, so southeastern Turkey is where Orhan and his family grew up. After his father came to Berlin, his family stayed in Kurdistan, but then his mom decided to follow 7 years later. That wasn't the plan originally, but as we know, a lot of the guest workers ended up staying, even if it wasn't the plan originally. And Orhan's siblings started to apply for visas. Also, he has 5 siblings. They slowly made their way over to Germany, but by the time Orhan applied, he was over 16. And the way German family reunification policy works is if you are over 16, there are other factors that come into play besides do you have family in Germany. They look at things like your German language proficiency or your ability to integrate. So his request was denied. He stayed, he lived with his grandmother. His parents, with the money they made in Germany, decided to build a house in Izmir, in another part of Turkey. Orhan moved to Izmir, started working there. And then in 1993, there was a big conflict between the Turkish government and the Kurdish rebels, and his hometown was destroyed, so he stayed in Izmir. And he ended up going to Germany for work, because he worked making stoves, and the factory that he worked for had exported a stove to Germany. There was a problem, he got to go. He saw his family, he stayed for a month, and then he came back, and then he applied for a visa again. He said, well, now they trust me because I came back. He got the visa, he went to Germany, and he applied for asylum. He ended up getting to stay because his hometown had been destroyed. And Orhan has now become, since then he started in construction work and then became a taxi driver. He failed his license 3 times because he couldn't pronounce the names of the streets correctly. But ever since he's been a successful taxi driver, he goes back to Kurdistan about 4 times a year. And he has 2 children from 2 different marriages, and he jokes that they are 59% Migrationshintergrund. With the older one, he speaks Turkish, a little bit of Kurdish when he's angry, he says, and with the younger, he says he tried for a year and then gave up, and he regrets that a little bit. So with this story, we've told a personal story about a man's life. We've included kind of political and historical context to educate our readers about the frames of this man's life. And what I hope when I write a story like this is that it encourages other people to get out there and talk to people and have more meaningful connections besides what you assume when you first see someone. So we write 4 kinds of stories we categorize them in 4 ways. Spaces and places. That's the Don Juan Center in Lichtenberg. We wrote about that. Local stories about people in Berlin. Policy and practice. And our lens, kind of how our experiences inform how we look at immigration and multiculturalism. And we believe that if we view our city's pockets and spaces of difference as opportunities, we'll become more empathetic, inclusive, and participatory in the process, and can begin to realize global values within local communities.